Ah, yes, we're all here. Hey, everybody, it's Onepeg. How are you? Good to see you. Good to be seen. So, a couple of days ago, I ended up uploading a video that had to do with running Shoreline jackets because it seemed like it was kind of an out-of-the-way place that I really never saw anybody. And even though I dodged all of the stashes and mentioned that you didn't have to and you could loot things like the villa, it still netted over 1 million rubles an hour worth of revenue. And I thought that was kind of awesome, especially considering that I didn't die at all and it was kind of empty. But there were a lot of comments in response that said 1 million rubles an hour was chump change and that people were making 5 million rubles an hour. Okay, well, if that's that reliable, then why not share those loot runs and I'll run them and see if that's actually true instead of just maybe like a one-off. We're going to do just that. We're going to test out which of the loot runs that people suggest are reliable, especially if they're reliable, how risky they are, and how much money they actually end up generating. At the end of the day, I just want to find out what's the best one. So there's what we're going to do. For all of the loot runs that you guys suggest, and I may ask you to be a little bit more specific than just say, go to customs, bro, I'm going to run them, and we'll see which ones end up the best. We'll rank them like they do in Top Gear. English Top Gear, by the way, not American. If you guys like American Top Gear, you're horrible human beings, and you should be ashamed of yourselves. So what we're going to try to do is maintain some amount of uniformity with the original jacket run video. So we're going to establish some ground rules. First, we're going to keep track of the number of times that we die. Second, we're going to account for the cost of what that death equated to. Third, we're going to make sure that we sell everything on the flea market that we can insofar as it has a decent markup in value. We're also going to make sure that we offload the loot from our inventory as quickly as possible over a 5-hour period of time where we're going to chain run this as fast as we possibly can, and I'm going to do the entire thing live. So for any of these videos, if you end up wanting to see those loot runs as an example or whatever else, you want to scrutinize how I was able to do this for whatever reason because you're a douchebag, I don't know. So that way we act completely transparent, and I'm also going to try and be as fair with the time as I possibly can be. If there's a moment where I have to get up and go take a piss or for whatever reason, I'm going to add time to the clock to make up for that lost time. Ultimately, the idea here is that I'm trying to make it look like I'm not padding any numbers. Now, this Interchange stash loop run specifically does not include the 21WS key. For those of you that are unaware, the 21WS key opens a USEC stash in the top of a trailer, Connex, whatever, inside of one of the parking lots as long as the power is on, and typically ends up having some pretty valuable stuff inside of it. Now, most people that have talked about it have said it's somewhere between 200 and 500K worth of loot. But obviously, there is a space requirement inside of your backpack to be able to fit all of that stuff. Depending on what the comments say, and they're saying, well, you need to run 21WS. If that's what I have to do, then I'll do this over, and we'll do a separate run where I include it, and we'll see what the results look like then. Now, while this B-roll is going, I figure we'll discuss some pros and cons, because I think that there are some benefits to this versus other runs, and there are some negatives as well. Now, right off the bat, the thing that is most apparent about the stash runs is that they're going to take a little bit longer. There's really no denying that at all. In the case of the Shoreline run, that took 10 minutes, maybe 11, whereas the stash runs, depending on where you spawned, ended up taking a little bit longer. And I want to be very clear about the loop that we're taking as well. Now, this is the Interchange stash map. And these are all of the stash locations that are known on the map, unless Nikita and BSG decide to add or remove some. These are all of them. Now, most of the PMC spawns that you will see on this map are around the outside edge of Interchange, which is what we want. So if we clean this map up a little bit, but maintain the orientation and, maybe make it look a little bit different, whatever, you can see in the northeast corner, as this map is oriented, is the power station. Now, that corner of the map, that quarter of the Interchange map, has the least number of stashes in it. So unless we spawn there, the plan is to try to avoid that. So if we spawn up near number 3, the railway exfil, what we're going to do is try and run south along past Scav Camp, past number 2, around the corner, and over to number 6, and leave through Emercom. The same is true if we spawn at the Emercom side. We're going to end up running west and then north out the railway, grabbing all of those stashes along the way. If we spawn at Power Station, what we want to do is check to see which of the 2 major extracts it is that we have on our list, and we want to instead take the long way around. We don't want to take the short route because that would be too little loot for the run, and we want to make sure that we maximize on our time. So at least that's the plan. Now, the other thing that I did not do was loot the suitcases. Those have the same loot pool that duffel bags do, and we could try that as well. If we're going to include 21WS, I could also include the suitcases for another run and see, again, if it's worth it. But if we want to talk about pros and cons, the thing that I guess really stands out most of all is that the jacket space versus the stash space is drastically different. Jackets are 2x2, and the stashes have significantly more space available to put stuff in. Because they have significantly more space, that means that the stuff that is available to fit in them has a much wider and more varied loot pool. On the pro side, you will get an awful lot of armor, helmets, rigs, and other wearables, which is kind of nice. You will also get a lot of guns, and you're also going to get a lot of ammo. There isn't going to be a high quantity of any particular item like we saw with jackets. Now, that could also end up being a con at the same time, because jackets obviously have a very high focus on keys. Just about every key in the game, every mechanical key in the game spawns inside of jackets. So that has an awfully high focus. At the same time, that also means that there isn't as much of a space requirement needed in order to be able to make that loot run work. But in the case of this run specifically, you really need a lot of space to be able to fit everything if you're going to try and maximize on your time, which means that you need bags like a Blackjack 50 and like a BlackRock rig that has a little bit more space to it, maybe even an Alpha, so that you can fit everything in there that you need to. Now, the weapon isn't necessarily as important. So for the purpose of this, if we're talking about cost of dying, we're going to use a BlackRock rig, a Blackjack 50 backpack, and a PM pistol. Maximizing space, but not necessarily having to go all in on firepower or armor either. Now, obviously, because of the popularity of this stash loop, it's also going to be something popular for other people. For full disclosure, I'm actually running this on a pretty low population server, someplace out in the middle of the EU where almost no one plays. But even then, on multiple occasions, I ended up doing this stash run, finding stashes that were already looted and following the trail of another person that had been in front of me. And in the cases where I saw those, most commonly, I ended up seeing at least one dead body where somebody had been on that same loot run and got killed by another loot runner. If we add to that 3 separate times where I actually did die, now luckily I never ended up dying toward the tail end of one of these loot runs. It always kind of happened toward the beginning, so there wasn't a whole lot of lost time there, which is good. But I did die, and I still ended up losing the starting equipment that I just listed. But anyway, let's talk about how this stacked up. So for our interchange stash loop, in the 5-hour period of time, we were slightly lower than the quicker raid cycle of 25 on Shoreline at 20. Of those 20 raids, we died 3 times. Now I'm going to scroll nice and slow for y'all, so that if you want to pause it, you can, so that you can look at all of the figures. Basically, I paid attention to the things that ended up making like actual real money. And if it was miscellaneous food stuff or miscellaneous barter items that weren't going to sell for any more or any less on the flea, we just kind of sold off the remaining pile. There's a huge, huge stash requirement for 5 hours of running these stashes. I had to buy an extra scav junk box. I had to buy 2 ammo cases, and I filled 5 eye cases with items that wouldn't go in either one of those. And I filled half of a holodilnic thermo bag. So our stash loop runs counted to 20. We were able to make a loop of 20 raids with 3 deaths. So it ended up being 5 raid runs less than what I could pull off on Shoreline. You can see that there was an awful high item count. And this is also not accounting for the items that didn't end up being sold individually because they weren't making sense to sell on the flea market. I'll scroll nice and slow so that you guys can read all the stuff that ended up getting sold and for how much and what the fees were, if that's what you want to do. But we get down to the bottom here. In terms of total loot that was barterable, it was about 3 million rubles. In terms of total loot after costs, that was other loot like armor and weapons and grenades. That was just shy of 2 million. And then we go to the ammo that was found that was worthwhile to sell individually, and then the miscellaneous vendor ammo like HP and PS and PRS sold off to vendors, and that was another million. So we're just shy of 6 million. Then we also have to account for our losses, which ended up being pretty substantial because blackjacks are about 170K a piece on the flea, PM pistols are 7K, whatever, and a BlackRock rig is about 45K from the flea or a vendor, depending on who you buy it from. Not very expensive. The big loss here was the blackjack, and I will reiterate that you really do need the space. I filled it every single time that I ran this. That ended up being a total cost of just shy of 700K, which means that our earnings after losses is 5.3 million to 1.06 million, 1 million rubles per hour with an earnings per raid of 265K. So here's what I would say about this. Not a bad run. The interchange stash loop would be more beneficial to people that are trying to get weapons, armor, and stuff like corrugated hoses that don't typically spawn inside of jackets. But you're not going to get any keys. If the focus is to try and get keys, then you want to run the jackets instead. but they both make about the same amount of money. And I think that the margin of error here is probably the same. One thing that I will say, though, is that the repetitiveness of this is not nearly as grindable as the jacket loop. The jacket loop is much faster and takes up much less of a space requirement. So in terms of cost of doing business, if you want to think about it that way, the jacket is probably more reliable in terms of money earned over time than what you would see from the Interchange stash loop. 21WS key might be required, but it has a cost requirement. You have to buy a 21WS key. In between where you are right now in the wipe and where that key was in terms of cost, a couple of months back, it may be cost prohibitive for people. Now, maybe not now because most people have one, and it really is just like an opportunistic thing. You don't want to take your time to go over to Power Station unless you spawned there, and you really are only going to loot it if you run by with the power on. So this could end up kind of knocking that value up a little bit more, but really, it's not going to do that much different. You're talking... this is a pretty good sample size. I mean, 5 hours of constant runs is a lot. I mean, I'm trying to look for actual evidence, not just anecdotal stuff where you found 17 Bitcoin and 4 stashes or something. I don't know, guys. What do you think? Did I screw the pooch? Was I just not running fast enough? Let me know what you think. Leave me some comments. Make some suggestions on what loot loop should I run next, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.